Welcome, and thank you, George. So first of all, I want to thank Mitzi and Wade and the entire team there for the opportunity today to speak to everyone. And more importantly, thank Maine for the opportunity to work with the state. We had for a few years represented the state with trade and investment attraction in China, and have unofficially continued that relationship and worked with the state, and I've had a chance to travel there many times. I'm a Northwoods boy who was displaced to Asia nearly 30 years ago now, not from Maine, but from Minnesota, but very similar in how we look at things. And I've certainly enjoyed my trips there. As George said, our firm was co-founded by myself and a business partner in 1995. We celebrated our 25th year this year. We now have 11 offices, 10 in Asia, 1 in the US, and we have assisted companies both big and small to develop and execute their export and trade strategies, as well as public sector looking at how to attract investment in the region. If you could go to the next slide, George. So today I'm going to talk about China, exporting to China and exporting to ASEAN. And we're going to, just a little table of contents here, talk a little bit about the slide in the Chinese economy, where it is in COVID, the status of sort of US-China trade issues, what the new administration means, and then highlight a couple of sectors for China that are important export opportunities that Maine, of course, is strong into. Next slide, please. So the macroeconomic side of things, I think, you know, everybody knows China is the world's second largest economy. It is also one of the few economies that is performing strongly now. It's one of the world's largest consumer markets. In terms of people, of course, it's number 1. In terms of dollars, it's number 2. And it really is something that you can't ignore as a market, particularly in the times that we have today with so much uncertainty due to the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please, George. So economically, China is one of the very few countries that is showing positive GDP growth this year. They are forecast to have 2.3 at the end of the year. That I believe will be what the final numbers come out at, or very close to that. And China, being the world's second largest economy, is really the only one in the world of significant size that expanded versus contracting during the COVID crisis. And I think this is really important because when you think about the global economies contracting in 2020, and many of them are going to struggle in 2021, one of the markets that you really have to think about as an export destination, despite some of the difficulties of exporting into China, is China. Next slide, please. So in the end of 2019, there was the phase 1 US-China trade agreement. So after 2+ years of lots of very difficult and very tenuous discussions and negotiations between the two sides, the US and China, they came up with a phase 1 agreement. And this agreement was put in place to have China purchase a certain number of goods under the existing tariff structures on both sides, and then evaluate what would possibly occur in terms of the tariff structures. Well, just as we sort of ended 2019 with the hope that there would be an ease to the US-China trade tensions, the pandemic hit. And so China did not do as good a job as it had hoped, and it ended up only purchasing 58% of what it had pledged to do. Okay, and so that's made a pretty difficult position right now for both countries as we have a new administration coming in and looking at what's going to happen. Now, it's understandable that during the pandemic, as the economy slowed, things weren't bought. But if you know, from a pure trade standpoint, they didn't meet their quotas. And so that'll take us into the next slide, if you would. What happens with our changing US administration? And, you know, I think it's important to recognize a couple things. One, in the past administration, Trump was probably correctly tough on China, and it should have happened in administrations prior to that, from a trade perspective. One of the things, though, that being tough on China that was difficult from the Chinese perspective is Trump's administration was unpredictable. And so the agreements changed on a day-to-day basis, which drove the Chinese a little bit nuts because they're planners, they're thinkers, they like to evaluate everything in a long-term viewpoint and all of the options of what could happen. And the Trump administration at times was able to make decisions or do things that they didn't believe could happen. And that was very frustrating for the Chinese side and led to the tensions right up and through the election and the inauguration just last week of President Biden, where China has really been sitting on the fence of what a new administration means. Now, the new administration in the US is also very clearly sending messages it's going to continue to be tough on China. The new Secretary of State, Blinken, agreed with his predecessor, Pompeo, on the Uyghurs, which are the ethnic minority that are in the far west of China, and China's being accused of human rights issues there. The appointment by Biden of Catherine Tai to lead the USTR is very important. She is very focused on labor. She's also a fluent Mandarin speaker. And so I wouldn't expect things from a trade perspective to change a lot as we move forward. The tariffs will probably stay in place, although we will have a more measured and strategic approach to the process, which will please China and probably make agreements something that will happen in a more timely manner. The wild card right now is what's happening on the Taiwan Straits and the South China Seas issues, as the U.S. has recently, if any of you look, sent military into the region. China's having games, and the trade cross-straits tensions have been quite high. So there's going to be some uncertainty, and what does that mean? That impacts potential economic exports to China, despite it being such a large growing economy, even in the pandemic age. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is e-commerce in China. And when you think about e-commerce, of course, the pandemic, helped to fuel more people buying online. But China, like it has done in much of its economic development, leapfrog technologies, and its leading technology companies sort of decided that with government support that e-commerce was going to become the platform that they were going to utilize versus bricks and mortar. And so despite, of course, a country with the size and scope of China, there are certainly bricks and mortar outlets, but the e-commerce is growing faster and is larger. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, if you add up the next 10 largest e-commerce markets in the world, they still don't reach China. And so what we've seen, of course, this is then bolstered a bit by the pandemic and not being able to travel, is that selling your goods and services on e-commerce has gotten easier and more desirable. And so many of our clients right now, particularly SME clients from states in the US, are focused on this, and there's a pretty good infrastructure. There are 7 leading e-commerce companies in China. They vary from, they all sell just about everything, but they have different areas of focus. Some of them were focused on appliances, some of them were focused on electronics, some of them are focused on consumer goods or lifestyle. Another one started in clothing. And they also have different price points where if you're trying to sell at a discount versus a higher value product. Alibaba, which is the owner of both Taobao and Tmall. Taobao is the largest e-commerce platform, and it itself is about 400 billion in turnover, and it with Tmall is about probably 40% of that number, of that total number. But Taobao is selling anything without really any quality verifications or checks. Tmall, owned by the same company, has a much more stringent quality side. And so the reason I'm going into such depth and detail here is when you're thinking about e-commerce, it's a very viable and cost-effective way to get your products and goods into China now. And it is a way to surpass, bypass some of the typical difficulties of dealing with partners there. And so it's something we would recommend SMEs and exporters look at. Next slide, please. So for China, we're concentrating on two sectors. We're concentrating on seafood, of course, which is near and dear to Maine, and particularly lobsters. And I'm sure everyone in the state knows when the tariffs were put in place, how it decimated the lobster industry. Now, with that said, if you look at the growth of fishery products that are being imported into China, and you look at other geopolitical issues, as an example, currently China and Australia have a very large political and trade spat that's going on. And so effectively, there are no more Australian lobsters going into China, which has created a huge surge in demand. And so now, even with the tariffs, Maine lobsters are certainly something that are going to start to be looked at as products that can come back in. So I think, in terms of growth, we have two things on the seafood side. One is to very carefully look at where the trade negotiations go and what is forecast on the tariff side. And then the second is the consumer demand for seafood is not going to wane. It's only going to increase. And that's just one part of the larger food industry that's increasing. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. So while Maine, of course, is most well known for its seafood, the state is very strong, as you all know, in other agro-food, both commodities and finished products. And China is a net importer of food. One of our state clients is Iowa. Iowa has, in the last year, been a huge recipient, of course, because of their commodity base of China purchases, but not only the commodities, it's also been finished and packaged value-added foods. And so this is an area that even small companies should be looking at as a potential opportunity in China. And so would very much encourage Maine companies that are in the agro-foods value chain to think about China as a potential market, because the demand is growing. It's going to continue to grow. The Chinese consumer is looking for more health conscious, higher value products, and has the disposable income to spend on that value. So that wraps up China. I think we're going to go into ASEAN next on the next slide. Okay, and to the next one, please. So topics, a little bit of a macroeconomic and political overview, where ASEAN is in terms of its COVID recovery, GDP, in where it plans to be in 2021. Then looking at, again, e-commerce and what's happening in ASEAN, what the US administration and political leadership of ASEAN is, and then what export opportunities are in two different sectors, life science, focusing on medical devices, and then aerospace defense, two of Maine's other strong sectors. Now, those same sectors we could swap, and we could talk about China for not defense necessarily, but for aerospace and particularly medical devices. And also the seafood demand and the agro-foods demand is quite large in ASEAN. So I'm happy to answer questions or follow up on that later with anyone who wants to know more about those sectors in ASEAN. Next slide, please. So first of all, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nation States, 10 countries. And, you know, the ASEAN Economic Community, which was formed about 20 years ago and continues to evolve, has gotten closer and closer. But while it's a huge trading bloc and investment bloc, both inward and outward, in Asia, just second to the South Asian subcontinent with India and its neighbors and China and East Asia, it is 10 different nations. And those 10 different nations range from Singapore as probably the most developed economy in the world. In many rankings, it clearly is. And then on the opposite end, places like Myanmar and Laos that are some of the least developed. So you have demand for goods in places like Myanmar for everything. Laos is largely agricultural. They also do a lot of resource extraction, so there's demand for things to do that. On the other end, you know, Singapore is the banking capital of the world, so e-commerce, you know, is something that is thriving there, fintech products. And then things in the middle, you know, you'd be surprised, I think, sometimes how developed the countries of Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines are in terms of their economic development and infrastructure. And so you've got this large, very diverse group. You also have a very diverse political group, culturally diverse, and religiously diverse. So sorry about that. I thought my phone was off. So if you could go to the next slide, George. So we talked a little bit about COVID and the recovery in China. China was extremely well managed, and it was something that has been not only occurring in China, although China had as an easier mandate to do so, it's occurred right across Asia. And I think there's several reasons for this recovery. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the population are, you know, more willing to follow the guidelines that the governments have put in place. There has been a lot of technology that's been employed that we can't use in the U.S. for concerns over infringement on your own private security. But in general, the Asian nations, and much of ASEAN, has managed COVID pretty well. And this means that we're having a not as sharp a V in terms of recovery of the economy as China has, but certainly overall another V shape, which is driving demand across the region. And it's again another market that you can export into as a main exporter. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the COVID recovery has been pretty good across the region, with the exceptions of Indonesia and the currently, according to the graph, Thailand, and that's where I'm actually based. But Thailand has a small outbreak now after 7 months of no COVID. But the only real exception is Indonesia, which really doesn't have the public healthcare system. And so most of the governments and their public healthcare systems have managed the outbreak well, which means the economies are recovering from a consumer demand basis. A place like Thailand, which 30% of its economy is dependent on tourism, of course, is not recovering as fast, but some of the other economies are in much better shape and should be seen as markets for main exporters. Next slide, please. So we talked about e-commerce in China, and so the size of the e-commerce economy is much smaller. The overall internet economy is is expected to be 300 billion in 2025. The e-commerce transaction part of that is 88 billion. And it's growing at a very rapid rate if you look at the growth in the bottom right corner on that graph. And so all across the region, buying online is becoming the norm, just like it is in much of the rest of the world, versus the exception. And so anytime that you can put your products into those e-commerce outlets, you're going to get exposure. And it is, again, like I mentioned on China, a way to cost effectively access and test the market. It doesn't take away the potential need for a distributor, somebody or an agent, or somebody to handle customs when your products come in, somebody to be able to create local language marketing materials. I mean, all of those things are still needed, but it gives you an ability to test the market, demonstrate that there's a demand for your product, which then allows you to be in a better position when you're looking for that distributor or partner to help you enter the market and ramp up sales. Next slide, please. So we talked a little about the politics and the new administration in the US. What does it mean to ASEAN? Well, for ASEAN, I mentioned the South China Seas for China. Well, the South China Seas disputes touch much of ASEAN, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines. And so this is a very hot topic. Also, China has been very aggressive in the last decade in terms of inculcating itself with ASEAN nations. And so, for example, there's the running joke that China owns Cambodia and Laos, and that those two countries are really beholden from an economic standpoint to China. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a market there, but there has been huge investment. There's been huge support of those lesser developed economies. Myanmar has had a lot of Chinese influence, has pushed back on it. Thailand, which has historically been very good at balancing East and West, continues to do so and is in the middle. Singapore is very similar in that respect, that it wants to trade with China, but it wants to maintain its independence and trade with the West. And so, because of the diversity of these 10 nations, it's very difficult to have a cohesive U.S. strategy from a political standpoint of how you'll work with the ASEAN economic community. And so the U.S. is engaging both with the ASEAN economic community as well as with each country on a bilateral basis. And the U.S. Indo-China strategy that they formulated in the past years is really a balance to the influence of China. And the benefit to the economies is that the U.S. is actively promoting business in the ASEAN countries, which means greater exports for companies from Maine. Next slide, please. MedTech. MedTech devices are in need right across the region. The region's diversity makes different products needed in different markets. And again, if you start at the lower income markets of Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, they need things because they're trying to improve their healthcare systems. You look at some of the more developed economies, the Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, they are really in a position where they're offering global world-class healthcare to the world. Medical tourism is one of the largest service sectors in Thailand and Singapore. And so they're buying the top-end medical devices because that's what is demanded by their customers, not only in their local countries, but from customers around the world. And so a couple of other things that have occurred in this sector is that during the pandemic, it has highlighted the existing gaps where we need more technology-enabled devices and platforms and more telemedicine. And so that's another thing that's growing. We'll look at Southeast Asia in general to grow from a medtech standpoint over the next decade. So anyone that's working in this space in Maine now should be looking at the region as an opportunity, but we'll have to spend time and some resources to be able to determine which of the countries are the best fit for their particular product or technology. Next slide, please. Singapore has led sort of the med tech push. It's the most developed economy in the region. As I said earlier, it has world-class healthcare. And the facts that we have on this slide, I think, are a good indicator of what is happening in the other countries like Malaysia or Thailand and what will happen in the other countries as they develop. And so, if you're looking to export, maybe Singapore is one of the first places to look for your medical technology, and then follow it up with Malaysia and Thailand in the region. Next slide, please. The other one is defense, and we've separated aerospace and defense. Our firm has done a lot of work for the US government when approached by US companies in the defense space, vetting potential distributors or customers. And as I said earlier, there's been this political shift from the US to balance China's influence. And so there is an active promotion of US technologies in defense in many of the ASEAN countries. And while these are, sales that take time to cultivate, they take local distributors for sure, they take relationship building. There is a very strong US government support right now for this. And there is a very large interest in US technologies. So aerospace, defense technologies into the region make a lot of sense. There's also been a movement of assembly and manufacturing of components from China for security reasons into other nations. Some of that's gone into Thailand, some of it's gone into Vietnam, some of it's gone into the Philippines, some of it's gone even into Singapore, despite its small manufacturing base, very high-end technologies. And so this is, again, an area where there's going to be increasing demand in a sector that Maine should be able to take advantage of its growth in ASEAN. I think, George, that's the last slide we have on ASEAN. Correct.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you so much, John. That was great. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the questions box. But I guess I'll get started off with one. So how should a Maine company go about finding a distribution or sales partner in China if they've never done business there before? And what are some things to look for and like criteria to evaluate those potential partners? John, I know you said like you can use e-commerce to bypass some of the traditional challenges doing business in China. But is there anything, is it still important to establish a partner there, and how to do that?
Yeah, so it's a great question, George, and it kind of depends on what the product is and what the technology is. But in general, China's a big place. And so what we don't advise is companies coming in and thinking they're going to sell to the entire Chinese market. It's segmented. You typically want to choose, a region to start in. And then, it's a process. You use the resources of your organization, of MITSI, you use the U.S. Commercial Service Office, you get direction, you hire outside advisors to do identification and search of potential distributors. I mean, I'll give you an example. In medtech, there are more than 25,000 medical device distributors. So for any company, big or large, that's very daunting. And so you really want to use the criteria of what are you looking for in a partner, matching that with who's there, and then having somebody help you vet that. So, it's hard to do as a real small company. And if you don't spend that time up front to do that, you can be at a lot of risk. And you can get in a position where you're selling to somebody that wasn't a good fit. or doesn't necessarily, didn't necessarily put together a deal that was good for you. And I mean, there's lots and lots of horror stories. I'm not going to go into those. I think people have heard those, but I think just be prudent, be slow, start with the state and the U.S. government resources, and then if necessary, work with a private group to do so.
Great. And Michael, I know since you're based in the U.S., could you maybe talk about some of your like the types of clients that you work with to do business in the region?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty active with all of our states that John mentioned at the top that we work with Iowa, but in addition to Iowa, we are also working with Minnesota, North Carolina. These are in different capacities. Some are in ASEAN, some are in China, Pennsylvania, New York. And so with the other ones?
Ohio and Maryland.
Ohio and Maryland, yeah, thanks, John. So we assist a lot of companies through those avenues in various capacities. It kind of goes across sectors. We've been very heavily involved in the food and beverage sector for a number of companies. That's going into both market assessments and distributor searches, market research platforms. So we kind of work across the board. And as John said, it depends on the type of companies that are seeking to expand their export or their potential for exporting into different markets, whether it be in China or into ASEAN or into the individual countries in ASEAN. So it's kind of a case-by-case scenario. And the best thing, as John said, is for the companies that are looking to expand their product exports, it's really understanding where they want to go, why they want to go there, and are they prepared for that type of export activity, and making sure they work with the state resources, as John mentioned, because you guys, Mitzi provides a lot of crucial information that will make sure that they're actually prepared for taking that step. And so we do a lot of support in that regard, making sure we're working closely with the states and their constituents and SMEs to find success. And our job is quite often to help them identify the opportunities, give them the right tools to succeed, and help and support.
Awesome. Sometimes when I'm working with companies, they'll be a little hesitant to do business in a region because of just like language or cultural barriers. And I'm wondering, is that a significant factor to consider before doing business in Asia? And if so, how can a company overcome that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And every country has local groups and people that are fluent in English. So you can always find it, but it can limit your distribution channels. One suggestion, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it's an accurate one, is go to a place like Singapore first for ASEAN, and get your feet wet there. While they're ethnically Chinese, the language is English in Singapore, and that's an easy place to start. One caution there is, Singapore being a hub for the region, any distributor will sell you on their capabilities in all of the 9 other ASEAN countries, and usually that is, while they may have capabilities, it just adds a layer of cost, and it's not necessarily the best way to go in. It may be in some cases, but starting in Singapore is a good place to go, and then getting referrals for companies to work with. As an example, the American Chamber of Commerce's in the region have local companies that are members of the chambers, and there are of course members there that are speaking English, and so that's another way to get introduced to resources that you can use to help give you guidance.
And I want to talk a little bit about e-commerce as well, because just a few months ago we had a webinar on expanding your business through international e-commerce, and one of our most well-attended webinars, because I think people are realizing how important it is, especially now. So and in terms of like, John, I know you mentioned Alibaba and one other e-commerce website. can a company in Maine use Alibaba to identify e-commerce opportunities in China, or is it mostly Chinese manufacturers selling to the United States? Or
No, I mean, there's actually 7 major platforms, and Alibaba's Tmall and Taobao are 2 of them. You can certainly put your products there. The difficulty is without any local assistance. I mean, going back to your earlier question on language, if you put your ad up in English and 90% of the consumers don't read English, you're not going to get as many hits on it. And then once you do, and I mean, of course, you can get somebody from one of the universities there in Maine, Chinese student or professor. You can easily get that stuff translated. Don't trust Google Translate. Google Translate is not, while it's getting better, it's not very good. And so getting stuff in the local language is important on the e-commerce platform. And then even when you do that, you will need to have some local support. You need to have, for example, in China, an import-export company that has a license to bring in your type of product. And so you have, and there's lots of those. So they're, and they just take a small commission on what they do. And it's, there's plenty of them that speak English, but you still need something on the ground to be able to bring it in once, to do the delivery of it.
Yeah, one other note on that too, like for example, Alibaba with Tmall, they do have kind of a team assembled, and I know this has been a push over the last couple of years, is to help smaller SME companies with how to manage it. And so they actually will assign like an account manager. The costs vary a little bit. I know they've been trying to scale it back, because I think at the outset when they kind of started that initiative without having kind of account representatives responsible for a particular company, the costs were a little bit high. But we interact with them in a couple of different organizations that we're involved with, and they've been trying to kind of make that more customizable to accommodate smaller companies that may not have like a huge budget for international expansion. And so that's something to investigate, because and that's just one example. I mean, Alibaba is a huge company, but they're trying to provide levels of service that would accommodate companies in whatever capacity they're trying to list their products.
And I mean, we were talking about China, but let's talk about ASEAN for a minute. So, Amazon's not in China, but Amazon's in a lot of the ASEAN countries. And then in addition to that, there's groups like Shopee and Lazada and others. And so it's pretty easy to Google who are the leading, e-commerce platforms in each of these countries. And most, if you look at, say, just the top 3 and you reach out to them, they're going to have pretty sophisticated people to be able to help a customer get things up online.
Right. And turning to ASEAN a little bit more, is there, John, I know you said like Singapore is probably a good place to start because a lot of people speak English there, but is there a country that might be more difficult, like one of the most difficult countries in the ASEAN to enter, or you'd be a little more cautious before going there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really based on sort of this socioeconomic development at this point in the country. Where's the economy at? So Laos is really hard, Myanmar is really hard, Cambodia is really hard, and that's sort of the bottom tier. And then the next tier, Indonesia would be next on that, and then you would go to the Philippines, and then it's Vietnam, Thailand, just kind of Malaysia, and then Singapore. And the only one I missed was Brunei. There's not many opportunities in Brunei. It's really dominated by its oil reserves. It's a kingdom. It's pretty closed. It's small. So I'm not sure there'd be much opportunity for that one.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, John and Michael, for this discussion. And just to everyone else, we are recording this webinar, so I'll send out the link to the recording. And please feel free to get in touch with me afterwards if you have any question for Mitzi or for John or Michael, or how you might be able to use a STEP grant to work with Tractus to develop into the Asian market or something like that, because we're here, and again, we're happy to help. So definitely feel free to reach out. But thanks so much. Looks like we'll end a little early, but have a great day, everyone, and be in touch.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thank you.